what we're looking at here, first of all, this sentence. This was one that a lot of students had trouble with. They got really, really close, but as you can see, we've got our verb here. Asafra, actually no, asafra. This is a doubling dagesh, and so this is going to be a vocal shabah, so asafra. And most people recognize that the root is safar, and also that it is Piel. We've got obviously three signs of the Piel here. We've got the reduced prefix vowel, and of course the olive prefix is going to tell us it's 1 CS. And then we've got the patach R1, and we've got the dagesh in R2. So that's three signs of the Piel. And I think most people translated it pretty well for a Piel imperfect, but there's one extra thing here. If this were imperfect, we would not have the comets hey ending. And so I'm not sure whether this is an issue of students didn't recognize this ending as cohortative. This would be cohortative 1C, I should say PL cohortative 1CS. I'm not sure if they didn't recognize the ending or if students didn't know how to translate this as cohortative. So to translate this, first of all, translating it as imperfect, most students said, I will tell or I will report. But to translate this as cohortative, it would be more like, may I report or let me report. Now, I kind of feel like this is a bad way to use the cohortative here, because this really does seem like permission in English. And we talked before about how the cohortative isn't really about permission. It's about expressing your will. Of course, when you ask for permission, you are expressing your will, but I'm not sure that the cohortative gets used for permission in Hebrew. And so that's the tricky part, is how do you bring out the cohortative, without thinking that this is asking for permission. And usually we use the English modal verbs let or may, but they're modal there. They're not like permission. So anyways, that was the main thing on this sentence that students got tripped up on, was translating this as an imperfect rather than as a cohortative. And of course that comets hey ending is what tells you this is cohortative. All right, so this would be basically, another way that you could do this as cohortative, I'm not sure if it would count as cohortative. You could make this, in English we would refer to this as subjunctive, and I wonder if this would fit into cohortative, but like conditional would be the idea. So maybe something like, I would report to you, like in a particular situation. Of course, the imperfect can kind of encapsulate that conditional possibility sort of idea as well. So I'm not sure whether or not this is a really good sentence to use this in, but again, it's not just I will, because that would be imperfect, and this is more than imperfect. So may I report to you, or I would report to you, or let me report to you, something like that. Okay, so I'm saying report to you. That's the lacha here. So lacha would be report to you. Lamed preposition, kaf, this is the 2ms suffix right here, and so that is going to be to you. And then we've got call. Oh boy, this should be kol. I feel like every single week there's a typo here that I have to go back and correct. So this should be kol, all. And then assure, this again, the relative pronoun. So I usually, if I'm glossing the relative pronoun, I'll start with which, all which. And then as I get through the sentence, I'll start to realize, well, which doesn't really work very well here. This should probably be more like all that. So let me report to you all that. Amar, this is just the cow perfect. He said. Who said? Avinu. Our, we have our with the new suffix here. And av is going to be father, our father, all that our father said. And then here we have the li, so this was to you, to ms. Here we've got the 1cs suffix on that lamed, so this is to me. Let me report to you all that our father said to me. We'll just put a comma here because that's the main clause, main phrase here. But I want to note something for you. Av is one of these words, and ach, the word for brother, also does this. There are some very, very old one-syllable words in Hebrew, one-syllable nouns in Hebrew, that when you add the personal suffix, they use this hirik yod connecting vowel. You don't see this often, okay? But on words like av and on words like ach, brother, and there are going to be some others, but those are the two I know off the top of my head, they're going to squeeze this hirik yod in between the noun and its possession suffix. A couple things to note about that. First of all, it can be confusing, because when you see that, you see the suffix as yod, nun, shurek. And one of the things that we talked about is whenever you have a plural noun, the suffixes that go on plural nouns, the primary difference between suffixes that go on plural nouns and suffixes that go on singular nouns is that the suffix will include a yod. But this is a weird situation where the yod is not part of the suffix. If this were plural, if this were our fathers, if this were our fathers, the form would actually be different. The form, instead of Avinu, the form would be Avotenu. And pardon me, I'm writing with a mouse, so it's obviously not going to look very good. But the form here, you would actually have the plural form of fathers, Avot, and then you would get this Sere Yod Nun Shurik suffix. So here, the Yod is part of the suffix. But here, when you've got the singular, this Hirik Yod that goes into Av, and that would also go into Ach, and again, some other nouns that I don't have off the top of my head right now, that Hirik Yod is not part of the suffix. That Hirik Yod is actually, if you've had Greek before, you'll know that Greek, or if you've had Latin, or German for that matter, you'll know that those languages, when a noun is in the genitive case, they will have a particular suffix, or they will have a particular spelling that indicates that they're genitive. And as we're learning Hebrew here, we learned that the form of the noun doesn't change depending on whether something is nominative or accusative or genitive or dative. The spelling of the noun doesn't change in Hebrew. It changes depending on whether it's masculine or feminine, whether it's singular, plural, or dual, and even whether it's absolute or construct, but the spelling doesn't change for case. Well, it used to. Very, very early Hebrew did have a genitive form, and that genitive form had a Hirik Yod suffix on it. Now, some of that is speculative based on other languages that are similar to Hebrew. I don't know that we actually have evidence other than what you see here of a genitive sort of case, but that's what's going on here with the Hirik Yod. And you don't need to remember that this is a sign of the genitive. You don't need to remember that, what this Hirik Yod stands for. All you need to know is that the Yod should not trick you into thinking that Av is plural, because if Av were plural, if this were our fathers, then you would have Avot as the noun, Avotenu as the form with the possessive suffix there. All right, so I wanted to point out what was going on with Avinu here, because that did get some students as well. Now that Todd's joined us, I'll catch you up on what we're doing here, Todd. The undergraduate quiz last week did not have any translations, but the master's level course, that quiz did, and so we had some students ask that I go through those, and there were only two, so we're going through those two translations. So this can just be review or practice for you guys, but that way the master's students who see this video, we will have gone through it for them. And then what we'll do once we go through these two is I've pulled a bunch of verbs from Genesis, and we're just going to walk through the text of Genesis, stopping at the verbs, and kind of parsing through them so we can practice what are the signs of the Piel, the Hiphil, the Cal, what are the signs of the imperfect, the jussive, that sort of a thing, just for some practice on parsing. Once I get through these translations, Todd, I'll give you an opportunity to throw anything else out there that you want to go over. So be thinking about that if there's anything else you want to cover. All right, so we've got here, let me report, or report is probably the best word, because in English, that's what allows us to translate this as to you. If we were to say, let me tell to you, that doesn't sound good in English. So let me report to you all or everything that our father said to me. And then here we've got a temporal pronoun. Now temporal preposition. This preposition can also function spatially, or you might call it locative, I guess. But here it's functioning temporally because the verb that it's modifying is this speaking verb. And speaking isn't really spatial, so spatial wouldn't make sense. I don't think. Well, it clearly doesn't make sense when we translate it into English. So, achere, and again, this is another situation where this should be just a sere here. So, achere, this is after. So the preposition is after. After what? What is the object of the preposition? Well, it's going to be this entire phrase. All right, so we've got an entire phrase here that is functioning as after. Now, you could say that maybe this isn't a preposition. Maybe this is an adverb. So the adverb after would be modifying this. But in English, we would treat this as the object of the preposition. So I don't think it really matters what we call this, whether it's an adverb or a preposition, because we have to account for this stuff here. So just looking at this phrase, we've got halakti, and halakti is just the Cal perfect 1CS form of halak, which is he went. So in the 1CS, it would be I went. And then here we have la'ir. La'ir is going to be the lamed preposition with the sign of the definite article. This kametz is the patach dagesh of the definite article, but because ayin rejects the dagesh, the patach will lengthen to the kametz. So we've got to the, and then ir here is going to be town or city. So this prepositional phrase then would mean after I went to the town, or after I went to the city. And so our translation, let me report to you everything or all that our father, I'll cross that out because this isn't plural, our father said to me after I went to the city. Any questions about this particular Hebrew sentence or the translation of it there? Okay. All right. Moving down here, we'll start with what is pretty obviously, and hopefully you guys are getting into the sort of, I don't want to say habit, but into the routine of recognizing the Vav relative on the what Furtado calls the imperfect form. It's probably better called on the jussive form. And because there's so much disagreement about what to call this form, do we call it the Vav relative plus imperfect? Do we call it the Vav relative plus jussive? Do we call it, some grammars call it the Vav consecutive instead of the Vav relative? A lot of people just call it the Vayiktol form. Vayiktol would be, if we took the paradigm verb katal, and we put a Vav relative on the jussive form of katal, it would be Vayiktol. So if you ever hear me say the word Vayiktol, I'm talking about what Furtado calls the Vav relative plus the imperfect. It's just a lot shorter to say the Vayiktol form. All right, but remember, the Vayiktol form, this is a form that takes, and Vayiktol specifically is on the imperfect. If it's on the perfect, if that Vav relative is on the perfect, we don't call it a Vayiktol, we call it a Vekatal. Vekatal is how it would be spelled if it were on katal. We would have the Vav, Shava, Kametz, Patah here. Vekatal is how we would pronounce that if it were on the perfect. Incidentally, the Vekatal form could be either the Vav relative plus the perfect form, or the Vekatal could be just a simple Vav conjunction plus the perfect form. And really the only way to tell the difference between them most of the time is context. If it's a simple Vav conjunction plus the perfect, it's not going to have that feature where it inverts the time. That's only if this is a Vav relative. Now, when you've got the Vayiktol form, it's really easy to tell that it's the Vav relative because it looks different. It has the Patak Dagesh here. But when it goes on the perfect form, it doesn't look different. And so you won't always know, do I invert the tense here or not? A lot of times you'll have to use context. But luckily, we don't have a Vekatal form. We have a Vayiktol form. And so looking at that, we can see our Vav Patak Dagesh. So that right there, we're just going to log away. This is the Vav relative. And then we want to look at this form and think through... it might be good at this stage for you to have just sort of a process of parsing to say, okay, first I'm going to look for the conjugation, try to determine the conjugation. Is it perfect, imperfect, whatever? Then I'm going to try to determine the stem or the pattern. Is it cal, Piel, Hiphil? Then I'm going to try to determine the person, gender, number. It might be helpful at such an early stage to have that sort of process in line so that you don't forget to parse part of it. You don't forget any of those elements. But the more you do this, the more you're in the habit of kind of parsing stuff at a faster speed, you're going to move away from that process and you're going to kind of tend more towards, okay, what sticks out? Like, what do I immediately recognize about this? And obviously, one of the things that's most immediately recognizable is that Vav relative, that Vayiktol portion. And since it's Vayiktol, I know that this is going to be a jussive form of the verb. So it's not going to be perfect. Because if it was perfect, it wouldn't be Vav Patak Dagesh, it would just be Vav Shava. So I know it's going to be perfect. Or I'm sorry, I know it's not going to be perfect. I know it's not going to be imperative. I know it's not going to be a participle or an infinitive or a cohortative. I know that it's going to be the jussive form because that's what the Vav Patak Dagesh attaches to, is the jussive form. All right, so I already have noted my Vav relative. I already know that it's going to be jussive. Now what else do I see here? Well, the other thing that I see is the Shurik suffix. It's not Noun Shurik, it's just Shurik. All right, and since it's jussive, I also know that the consonant next to the Vav is going to be my prefix. All right, so when I have a Yod prefix plus a Shurik suffix, that is always going to be the 3MP. The only thing I have to figure out now is the pattern, or sometimes called the stem. Is this cal? Is this Piel? Is this Hiphil? Well, the things that we're looking for as far as stem goes, or pattern goes, are our prefix vowel. That's usually indicative. And then, not quite as reliable, but also helpful, are going to be our R1 vowel and whatever is related to R2. So here we've got a Shava and a Dagesh. So the Dagesh is pretty noteworthy here. We know it's a Dagesh forte. I mean, it is a Bagad Kafat letter, so maybe the Dagesh is irrelevant. Maybe it's just the weak Dagesh in a Bagad Kafat letter when it begins a syllable. I shouldn't say begins a syllable, when it comes after a consonantal sound. But this one is not coming after a consonantal sound. It's coming after a vocalic sound. And so that tells us this is a doubling Dagesh, which means it's there for a reason. All right, so that is something that occurs in the PL. The Patak in R1 is something that occurs in the PL. And the reduced prefix vowel is another thing that occurs in the PL. So everything here points to PL. If it were cal, we wouldn't have a Shava in the prefix. We would have either a Hirik, usually, and then a Shava in R1. Or in some, like, one Alepphs, we get a Holem prefix vowel. And in the true one Yods, we'll get a Hirik Yod prefix vowel. And in the one Yod Vavs, we'll get a Sere Sere pattern. None of that is happening here. So we would expect one of those situations if it were cal. There's no other explanation for the Dagesh in R2. That will only happen here. Like, the cal isn't going to do that. The Hiphil isn't going to do that. Only the Piel does that. If this were a Hiphil, we wouldn't have a Shava in the prefix. We would have a Patach in the prefix on the imperfect family. In the perfect family, that's not going to be a patak. That's going to be either a hirik or a segel. But in the imperfect family, that's going to be a patak, and we don't have a patak. All right, so we left off somewhere over here, and I just wanted to clarify that if we ask ourselves, okay, what do we look for in the cal, or what are the signs of the cal, what are the signs of the Piel, what are the signs of the Hiphil, that's where it's good to have sort of, again, I don't know if the best way to do it is to just create a document with a list of here are the clues for the Piel, here are the clues for the Hiphil. I don't know if it's best to create like flashcards that have, you know, Hiphil on the front and then the clues on the back. I don't know what the best way is, but memorizing maybe not, but just knowing these clues is what's going to speed up your reading and your recognition of these different stems. So the clues that we see here, again, and the clues are usually going to be, what is your prefix vowel, if you have one? I guess the first question is, do you have a prefix? And what is the vowel? And then what is your R1 vowel? That's also going to be very indicative. And then what's going on with the second root letter? If it has a particular vowel, like a hirik yod, that's a good sign that you're in the Hiphil. Hiphil doesn't always have hirik yod, but it does sometimes. Does it have a dogish? That's a good sign, especially if it's a strong dogish. It's a good sign you're in the Piel. But again, Piel won't always have it, so that's kind of a secondary clue. But again, if you can just sort of remember, here's what to look for, it's really going to speed up your parsing. So we've got this parsed out. Now we have to figure out what it means. So accounting for everything that we see here, we would now ask, okay, so what's our root? And our root is going to be dalet, bait, and resh, which is davar. And that's terrible writing, but again, sorry, I'm writing with a mouse, and it doesn't work very well. So davar is going to be our root. Davar, we know, usually occurs in the Piel. In fact, the definitions that we've learned for davar are the Piel definitions. I can't remember whether or not it ever occurs in the cal, but I have no idea. I can't think of any instance where it does. So this would be one of those verbs where Fatano mentions that some verbs don't have a cal form. Their base form is going to be Piel, or their base form is going to be Hiphil, and there is just no cal corresponding form in the Hebrew Bible. So davar, I think, is one of those that doesn't really use the cal, or at least if it does, I'm not familiar with it. So the main meaning that we have for davar is to speak. So if it means speak, and the cal perfect 3ms, the lexical form would be he spoke, then here we've got the vav relative on the imperfect form, or the jussive form, what we call the vayiktol. The vayiktol is going to be past time. And it's not 3ms, it's 3mp, so this is going to be they spoke. Again, you can ask, well, why not just use the perfect? Why not just use the cal perfect 3 cp for that if it means the same thing? And the reason is, at the sentence level, it probably doesn't make a difference. But when you get to larger chunks, especially in narrative, the vayiktol form is going to be used in narrative to move the narrative forward. If you stop all of a sudden and you have a perfect, that's actually an indication of maybe a disjunction in the flow of the narrative, like highlighting something or something standing out. Whereas the vav relative is the form that's going to be used to just sort of carry the narrative forward. That's why some people refer to it as a vav consecutive, because it kind of gives you consecutive action in a narrative. So on the sentence level, they would be translated the same, but at the bigger level of the narrative itself, maybe a paragraph, they're gonna indicate different things. All right. So he spoke, or I'm sorry, they spoke. And then again, when we have a third person verb in Hebrew, we will often have an explicit subject. If we have a first person verb or a second person verb, the only real explicit subjects we could have for those would be pronouns. So we often don't have subjects apart from the verb when it's second person or first person. And we don't always have them when it's third person, but if it's third person, we might. And so here we look right next to the verb, because that's where we would expect a subject to fall in Hebrew if there is one. And sure enough, we see a noun, ha naveim, and we see that it is masculine and plural, which matches the verbal form. So this is a perfect candidate for the subject of our verb. The prophets spoke. All right. Then we go to our next word, because we're not just from this, we don't really know what to anticipate, but to see a lamed following a verb of speech is very, very common. They spoke to whom? Lamed. We've got a strong dogish and a patak, so that's the sign of the definite article. To the, and if we take this stuff off, we get melech, which that's our lexical form for king. We know what melech is. So the prophet spoke to the king. And here, immediately I see vav patak dagish. So we've got another vayiktol form, which is, again, this is the consecutive action. They spoke to the king. This is one reason why the vav patak dagish sometimes gets translated as then rather than and. So they spoke to the king, and next, here's what happened next. So now let's just parse this out. I want to just translate, but let's stop and parse it out. So we've got vav patak dagish. That dagish is in a prefix letter, and that prefix letter is yod. So that tells us we're in the third person masculine. Yod prefix is always third person masculine. And we've got a shurik suffix. So that's going to be 3mp again. All right, so if we take off the prefix and we take off the suffix, we have 3 letters. That's exactly what we want in our root. And so sure enough, this is our root, amar. Amar in the perfect, 3ms, the lexical form, means he said. So here, it's going to be 3mp, they said. And again, the perfect versus the vayiktol form, they're going to be translated the same here. But this would be basically, and they said. Now, I'm a little bit surprised that we don't have, between these two words, I'm a little surprised that we don't have a key, maybe with a makef here. I'm used to seeing key introducing speech, direct discourse, and so it's a little bit surprising to me that we don't have it here. But I think when you put it together in English, you can figure out that this is obviously the content of what they said. So the prophets spoke to the king, and they said, Barech et Beit Adonai. So Barech. What is Barech? Well, we have 3 letters, which is what we expect to have in a Hebrew verbal root. So maybe this is our root. Do we recognize Beit Resh Kaf as a Hebrew root? And of course, we've learned Barach or Beirech would be the Cal Perfect 3MS form, as he blessed. But this isn't Beirech, this is Barech, which is different. We know that the perfect form is Hirik Dagesh Shava, but here the Resh can't take the Dagesh, and so instead, this Hirik lengthens to a Sere. That's how we get Beirech. But why would we have Barech? Well, we do have that lengthening because of the Resh. So what does it come that's lengthened from? Well, that lengthens from a patach. When do we have a patach in R1? That would be for the Piel stem. Now, the weird thing is, we have a patach in R1 for the Piel stem on the imperfect family. That's going to be the patach, because on the perfect family, we get the Hirik. So whatever this is, it's conjugated on the imperfect side because it has the patach, but there's no prefix. So then we have to ask, okay, well, in the imperfect family, what are those forms that have, we've got some forms have a prefix, but there are some that have no prefix. And those that have a prefix, they're going to be the imperfect proper, they're going to be the jussive, they're going to be the cohortative. But what are the forms that have no prefix? Well, those are the imperative and the infinitive. So this must be one of those. All right, so is this imperative or is this infinitive? Well, you could make an argument that perhaps, if it were infinitive, it would have an O-class vowel, but the Piel is really, the Piel doesn't have much regard for the preferences of the infinitive, and when it comes down to it, both the imperative, well, I should say the imperative 2ms, that form in the Piel, and the infinitive construct, those are going to look identical. All right, so Barek could be either one. So we now need to think through what are the translation differences and which one makes more sense in context. So we'll come back to that after we've translated the rest of this, because we need the rest of the context to kind of make that decision. So what we see next, though, is a definite direct object marker. That certainly tilts me toward one of these rather than the other. I'm trying to think whether or not the infinitive would have a definite direct object marker for its direct object, and it might, but when I see this, I definitely don't think infinitive. All right, but what is the object here? Beit Adonai. So Beit is the construct form of the noun bayit, and bayit basically means house, okay? Now, when it's the house of a deity, we often will translate it as temple, because that's what a temple is. It's the dwelling place of a deity. But this basically means house of Yahweh. And we would actually say, because Yahweh is a personal name, it's definite, even though it doesn't have the definite article, because all personal names are definite. They're referring to a specific person in this case. So this would make Beit definite as well, because the definiteness of the construct will match the definiteness of its absolute. So this is, whether this is to bless, or whether this is the imperative, bless, they're telling them to bless or bless Beit Adonai, the house of Yahweh, or the temple of Yahweh. So as we read back through, which one makes more sense? To bless? Or simply bless as a command. The prophets spoke to the king, and they said to bless the house of the Lord. I will go back in the Unit 12 quizzes for the graduate students, and if you translated Barek as an infinitive construct, I won't count you off for it. I don't think that's the best translation, but I could see why you might think that. Okay, so that's it. Those are the translations from the quiz last week. Again, I want to go through for a little while, just go through some of the verbs in Genesis 1 and practice parsing. But before that, Todd, I want to make sure, is there anything that you want to go over or take a look at? Any questions you have?
not specifically. The only thing I'm really having trouble with is the words we haven't learned, looking them up in the lexicon.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah, I had another student talk to me about that as well, partially because I think the directions were a little bit confusing. So let me take a moment, first of all, to clarify the role of the lexicon at this point, and then talk a little bit about learning how to use it. So the first thing is that I want to make sure it's clear you are not to use your textbook on the Unit 13 quiz. Now, I'll also say we will not have a quiz for Unit 14. There is no quiz next week, but for Unit 13, you're not to use your textbook or the vocabulary list from your textbook on that quiz, but you may use the concise Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, that secondary required text that was listed in the syllabus, that you used to do your lexicon exercises. Now, again, I'm not sure if the undergraduate students had that lexicon exercise. So what I'll do in Unit 15 is I will publish a list of vocabulary words from lessons after lesson 30 that you need to know the meaning of. Let's go to Genesis then. And what we'll do, again, I've just taken the Genesis text, and I did a morphology search in Logos that basically allowed me to highlight every verb in Genesis, except for those that are in stems that we haven't learned yet. So it didn't highlight any nifals, it didn't highlight any puals or hofals or anything like that, hiphils. It's only highlighting the verbs that are in stems that we've learned. So as we go through here, I'm not going to spend time reading, the sentences unless it's helpful to the parsing, because we've kind of gone through most of these verses anyways already. But the first one that we have here is bara. Now, I'd like to give you guys a chance. I don't know whether that's helpful to you or not, but I feel like making this a little bit more interactive would be a good idea, because it's easy for me to just rattle off, here's what to look for, here's what you see and all that. But if you have to stop and think, that's called active recall, and that's going to help. So what I'll do is I'll do the first one here, and then I'll have, if you don't mind, I'll have Todd, can you do the second one? And then Kristen, the third one. And then we'll just kind of go back and forth like that around in a circle, because I think that will be more helpful. So if you don't want to do that, that's fine. Just let me know. But I think that will, and you guys are probably like, well, how come he gets the easy one? But I'll walk you through it, okay? Because these are tricky, but we're going to walk through it together, all right? So bara is the first one. And fortunately, we've got 3 vowel letters, which that's what we would hope to see. 3 vowel letters, 3 root letters, because that's what a Hebrew verbal root needs to have. So maybe this is our root. It's always a possibility that the bait is maybe a bait preposition added on to an infinitive or something like that. But maybe it's just bara. And fortunately, we've seen that word. Now, I would say it's Cal Perfect 3MS because it doesn't have any prefix and it doesn't have any suffix, but Cal Perfect 3MS, I'm used to seeing a comets patak pattern, and here I have comets. Now, at this point, you don't really need to know why this is comets, as long as it doesn't throw you off, as long as you can still recognize this as 3MS. But I'll take a moment to just explain why it's comets instead of comets patak. The same thing happens with third hey verbs. Okay, so when you have a third aleph or a third hey in the Cal Perfect 3MS, you're going to get this comets because in those verbs, the third hey and the third aleph, the hey, neither the hey nor the aleph are actual consonants in those verbs. In the third hey verbs, the comets hey is actually a vowel ending, which may explain why the comets hey ending in third hey verbs doesn't like suffixes, because, and that's why that third hey in the Cal Perfect 3FS, that has to harden into a tav to take the comets hey suffix of the 3FS, because really the third hey and the third aleph, these are not consonants here. The third hey, comets hey, is the vowel, comets hey. You might say, well, aleph is never a vowel, and you're right. The aleph isn't a vowel here, but it's also not a consonant because we learned early on that when aleph closes a syllable, it quiesces. And what quiescing means is that not only, aleph is usually silent, not only is the quiescent aleph silent, it's so quiescent that it can't even close the syllable. And so this isn't really a letter at all. It's kind of like the silhouette or the shadow of an aleph when it's at the end of a syllable. And what that means is you've got an accented syllable because the stress falls on the second syllable here. So you've got an accented syllable that's open. And in Hebrew, when you have an open accented syllable, Hebrew really wants to avoid a short vowel there. So patak would be a short vowel. And so now you can also think of this as compensatory lengthening because the aleph quiesces. The patak lengthens to a comets to sort of compensate for the loss of the aleph, the effective loss of the aleph. But that's why we have a comets pattern here. So again, these vowel patterns are helpful for kind of figuring out what stem or pattern you're in and what conjugation you're in, because the Cal Perfect is going to have a comets patak pattern unless you've got some weak verb that is going to, mess around with that. So what we have here, bara, Cal Perfect 3MS from the root bara, which means he created. And so that's how we would translate it, is he created. All right, Todd. any idea, and I'll let you decide first, do you want to tell me first what the conjugation is? Is it perfect, imperfect, whatever? What the pattern is it cow, piel, Hiphil? Or do you want to tell me maybe what the root is? What's the first thing that you notice about this form?
First thing I noticed, I believe it's a cow, perfect, feminine, 3, singular.
Yes, perfect. Okay, that you've completely parsed it. Aside from telling me what the root is, what is the root of this verb?
Haya, I believe to be.
Exactly. So we've got haya, but we don't have the third hey. Like, this is the suffix hey. This isn't the consonant hey. So just as I mentioned before, I didn't realize this would be here, but this is that situation where a third hey verb, when it needs a suffix, that hey is not gonna be able to hold the suffix. So one of three things is gonna happen. In this case, where we're adding the comets hey, that hey is gonna harden into a tav. Okay. When you have a different vocalic suffix like assurik, the comets hey is just gonna drop out altogether. If this were 3CP instead of 3FS, it would just be hey, comets, yod, shurik. Ha, you, basically. It would drop out, the third hey would drop out altogether. Or if you've got a consonantal suffix that begins with a consonant like nu or ta or something like that, then you're going to have the comets hey shift into a hierik yod. And so you would get something like hayinu or hayita or something along those lines. So you've parsed that perfectly. Since this is 3FS in the cow perfect, and haya would mean be, or it could mean something like become, how would you translate this inflected form that's 3FS? What would you translate that as?
Was.
Yeah, she was, or you could say it was. Yeah, but was is right because this is just a verb. You know, it implies a subject. Now we're breaking out of verbs, but looking at the broader sentence, if you had to guess from the broader sentence, what would you say the subject of this verb is?
Via Haaretz.
Yeah, the haaretz right here. This is the subject. Now, one thing I'll point, again, I'm going to try not to go down a rabbit trail here, but one thing I want you to see is the word order is not what we're used to. We're used to predicate or verb first, and then subject after the verb. And here that's flipped, but there's a reason for that. Because this vav here is a vav shava, and it's not on a perfect or an imperfect. So what that means is, you know, we do see the vayektol form down here. Here, we see it down here, we see it all through this chapter. But what's happened here in verse 2 is we've broken the consecutive chain. What's happened here is we've got our initial statement setting the scene, and then we've got, instead of, like if we took out verse 2, it would read perfectly as a narrative. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God said, let there be light. Like, that would flow perfectly. What verse 2 is here, because it doesn't begin with that vayektol form, is it's parenthetical. It's kind of like an aside. It's kind of giving background information.
Reish het pay.
Yep.
Is that right? But I don't know for sure.
Yeah, very good. You've got it. So this is a root that we have not learned. You know, this is one that you haven't seen before, so there's no reason for you to know what the root would mean other than you know the context. You know what Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 are saying. So you're right, it does mean hover. Sometimes it's translated as, you know, circulate or brood, but it's that idea of maybe float. It's that idea of it's sort of waiting. You know, it's that, I don't know how to describe it. Hover is probably a good translation here. So what stood out, what stuck out, what stacked out to you was the mem. And of course, the vowel that the mem has is reduced. So just like you would have a reduced prefix on most of the PL in the imperfect family, you also have it in the participle. That mem is going to be very helpful. Now, not every word that begins with a mem, obviously, not every word that begins with a mem is a participle. And even not every mem plus verbal root, even that is not always a participle. But when you've got a mem shava, or a mem patach, or a mem kametz chatuf we'll learn about later, or a mem shurik, or not shurik, a mem shurik as well, but mem kibbutz, those are going to be good indications when they're followed by a verbal root that you have a participle. This particular one is actually a little bit interesting because it's not formed exactly how we would expect. And the irregularity here is that you've got a PL, as you know, again, the prefix vowel is your number one indicator, your number one clue of pattern. That tells you it's PL. There's really not much else it could be. But for it to be PL, this is a two guttural. I would expect this patak to lengthen to a kametz. In this particular situation, that doesn't happen. Now, this might be what we've referred to before as virtual doubling. This is something that happens with some of the definite article plus a guttural. Sometimes you don't get that lengthening to a kametz. you don't get a dogish and it just stays as a patak. Sometimes that's what happens. Maybe that's similar to what's happening here. But I would normally expect to see a lengthened, a patak lengthened into a kametz when you've got a Piel that's got a 2 guttural here. Doesn't happen. That's okay. It doesn't matter because the shava, the reduced prefix vowel, is enough to secure in our minds that this is in fact Piel. The other thing that's a little bit unusual, and it shouldn't be surprising because this is what we learned as part of the feminine singular participle forms, is this segel segel tav pattern, hefet here. This is the most common ending for a feminine singular participle. So that's one reason why we've learned it. But it is sort of, it's not the most common ending that we're used to seeing on verbs. So it is a little bit surprising. When we look at a verb and we see segel segel tav, there's really 2 times when that occurs. One is the feminine singular participle, and the other one is actually the infinitive construct form of a kal 1 yod vav verb. That's the one that you get like shevet for yeshav, or you get yada actually becomes da'at, and because of the ayin in yada, the segels here will shift to patak patak tav. But anyways, this segel segel tav pattern will either occur in a kal infinitive construct 1 yod vav verb, or you'll see it as the feminine singular participle. All right, enough of that. Go ahead.
The thing that made me question it was there was a dogish, but that's because it's a guttural. Is that
Exactly,
right?
exactly
Okay.
right. Yep. If this were not a guttural in that R2 place, you would have a dogish there. All right, next one. We've got vayomer, and vayomer is so common in the Old Testament, it basically means and he said. I mean, this happens all over the place, that you could almost make this particular form, vayomer, you could make this a vocabulary word. I mean, it is a particular inflected form of amar, but this may be the most common form of amar that occurs in the Old Testament. So anytime you see vayomer, you'll eventually just start recognizing this as and he said. But me knowing that this means and he said doesn't parse it for me. I need to think through the parsing. So the first thing that I notice here is vav patak dogish. That immediately tells me that I'm looking at a vav relative, or what I'm calling a vayiktol form. Since it's vayiktol, I know that I'm going to translate it as past tense, which is why I say and he said. But now I need to figure out what is the pattern here. Is this kal piel, hiphil? What's the pattern? And what I note is, again, the first thing I'm going to go to when I'm asking about pattern is I'm going to go to my prefix vowel. Now that's not going to help me in the perfect because the perfect doesn't usually have a prefix, but we're in the vayiktol form, so I will have a prefix. What is my prefix vowel? And this is where it gets a little tricky because my prefix vowel is a holum. And in the kal, I expect hirik. In the piel, I expect a reduced vowel. And in the hiphil, I expect a patak. But this is none of those. This is something totally different. This is a holum. This is where, thankfully, we spent a little bit of time talking about those 5 one aleph verbs that shift their prefix vowel to a holum. And when that happens, you get this holum. Well, you actually usually get a holum patak pattern. But this is because this is a jussive form that affects it a little bit. The reason why this is a little bit tricky is because this holum here, it's a segel, but if it were a sere, it would actually look a little bit like a calactive participle. But again, I remember that there are 5 one aleph verbs that shift their prefix vowel from hirik to holum in the imperfect family. And so that explains to me why it's not yod hirik, because this is one of those 5 one aleph verbs. So the holum is actually a kal prefix vowel in this sense. It's just an irregular one. So that's what tells me I'm in the kal. So I've got vayiktol, which covers vav relative plus imperfect or jussive or whatever. I've got kal. Now I need to figure out the person gender number. And so when I have a yod prefix, I know I'm third masculine. Yod prefix is always third masculine. Singular or plural is determined by whether or not I have a shurik here. And since I don't have a shurik, I know that it's singular. So this would be and is how I'm translating the vav. Or I could just say then, but then subject said. If I didn't have an explicit subject, which I do, if I didn't have this explicit subject, I would infer from the form that I should translate this as then he said. But since I do have a subject, I'm going to put that subject into my English translation, then God said. Or I could just say and God said. You could go either way, but what I wanted to point out here is a situation where then, as a translation of the vav, makes good sense. All right, so it makes good sense to say then God said. All right, now we have the next one. So looking at this form, what sticks out to you? What do you notice? How would you try to parse this?
I'm thinking it's jussive because of the yod and the shava at the beginning. That may not be good reasoning. And then I know it's like haya, or I know it's to be. I know it's like let there be, because I also know that how it goes in the translation too. But yeah, that's all I've got really.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, especially for what you've been exposed to so far. This is a form that you really haven't been exposed to. And there are some weird things about this form that are unexpected. So, and I honestly, I can't even really explain to you exactly, well, one step at a time. So let's walk through it together here. So first of all, we know that it's a verb because it's highlighted. You know, if this wasn't highlighted, then we might look at this and say, wow, that's a weird looking form. But thankfully, because it's highlighted, we know it must be a verb. And that kind of sets us on the right path. As a verb, it begins with a yod and it ends with a yod. So, I mean, it has 3 letters. That might make you think, okay, well, a Hebrew verbal root has 3 letters. Maybe this is my root. But then immediately you should remember that Hebrew verbal roots never end in yod. You're never going to have a Hebrew verbal root where the 3rd root letter is a yod. And the reason for that is because actually, historically, way back in early Hebrew, my wife's making fun of me.
No.
I thought she was trying to communicate with me and she was making fun of me. Way back in early Hebrew, there were some verbal roots that may have ended with yod, but over time, those turned into what we know today as the 3rd hays. Those yods were replaced with the comet's hay vowel ending. And so actually, the 3rd hay verbs that you see, those way back, those used to be 3rd yods, which explains why when you conjugate a 3rd hay verb with a consonantal suffix, it shifts to the heric yod because those are actually related to 3rd. Now, again, you don't need to remember all of this, but I just want you to know that when you come to a Hebrew verb and it looks like the 3rd root letter is yod, you can just always dismiss that as this can't be the lexical root because you're not going to have any Hebrew lexical roots that end in yod. All right, so if this is not my root, or if this is not part of my root, then I'm definitely missing something. I mean, I'm missing at least 1 letter, if not more. So now we have to figure out, okay, well, what would be missing? Is the yod part of, is the first yod part of the root? Is the hay part of the root? Now, we've not seen any hay prefixes, suffixes, or infixes, so the hay probably is part of the root. That's pretty secure. But what are we missing here? Well, when we're asking what are we missing, we can think of what are the letters that tend to drop out during conjugation. So obviously hays tend to drop out during conjugation. So we may be missing a hay. Nouns at the beginning of a word or at the end of a word, they will assimilate when they end a syllable and they're followed by another consonant. Nouns will drop out. Now by drop out, we mean they will assimilate and you'll see usually a dagesh, but we'll throw a noun in there. Also, yods at the beginning will tend to drop out. You know, these are the primary letters that we might lose. Another one would be either a hollow vav or a hollow yod. Those can tend to drop out. So these are the types of letters that we're thinking in the back of our head. Maybe this is one of our missing letters. If it's a hay, that's where we started, it would be missing from the end. You're not going to lose a hay in root letter 1 or root letter 2. It's going to be the 3rd root letter where it goes missing. So if we apply hay here, we would apply it to the end, and we get hay, yod, hay. And that is a root that we're familiar with. That is hayah. And that would explain this yod as our prefix letter. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's something weird about this. And the thing that's weird about it is the prefix vowel is shavah. It's reduced. And that would ordinarily tell us Piel, because the cal prefix letter would be heric. But for some reason here, this form of hayah, the prefix, is reduced here, even though it's cal. And I don't know what the reason for that is. I don't know why it reduces here. I mean, I'm aware that it does for this verb. I'm aware that this form does reduce. But what's happening here is, and I think you mentioned that you thought this might be a jussive form. That's what this is. This is jussive, which is why we lose the hay, even though it doesn't have a suffix, because in the jussive form, 3rd hays will lose their 3rd hay. This is the jussive form, and the jussive ordinarily would have the same prefix letter as the imperfect, which I would expect to be a heric. I'm not sure why we get... It may have to do with the fact that the first letter is hay. So either way, if we know that this is jussive, that tells us pretty much right out the gate that it's going to be 3rd person. Is this masculine jussive or feminine jussive?
I would guess masculine.
It's a good guess because most of the verbs in the Hebrew Bible are going to be masculine rather than feminine. The feminine form would not begin with a yod. It would begin with a tav. That's another way to tell. So we know the pattern is cal. We know the conjugation is jussive. We know it's 3rd person. We know it's feminine. And then I guess we could ask, is it singular or plural? And what would you say? Is it singular or plural? And why? And why do you think that?
There's nothing after the yod.
Yeah, I mean, that's good. If it were masculine plural, we would expect a shurik. If it were feminine plural, we would expect, first of all, that tav prefix. And then in the jussive, we would have that same na suffix, noon, comet's hay. We'd have that same suffix that we see in the imperfect 3FP. So we've got it fully parsed. We know that hayah means was or be or become or come to be. You know, those are all translations of hayah. But when you take that verbal root and you put it in the jussive, now I know you know what this verse probably says, but just thinking about haya in the jussive, third masculine singular, how would you translate this word?
Let there be is what I would say, but that's because I probably already know it. You know what I mean? Yeah, but who is he speaking to let there be? Just in the void?
That's a great question. Like, who is this? So we talked about how the jussive, the imperative is when you're expressing your will directly to the person that you expect to respond. The cohortative is when you express your will and you expect yourself to be included in the response to that expression. And the jussive is used when you express your will and you expect the response to come from someone that you're not even talking to.
Right.
So in one sense, there's a lot of presuppositions that would go into the interpretation of this verse. One presupposition would be, does light exist yet? And you could say, well, he's telling light to exist. If it already exists, he wouldn't tell it to exist because it exists. So light doesn't even exist yet. So he can't be speaking to the light because light doesn't exist, which might explain why he doesn't use the imperative, where he might actually be speaking directly to what he expects to respond. So, but is he speaking to the heavens and the earth? Is he, and not to them, because he would then use the imperative, but is he saying something like, yeah, I mean, it's almost like he has to, what am I saying? This is God speaking. God doesn't have to do anything. But grammatically speaking, you might say grammatically, the jussive it demands the jussive because light doesn't exist yet. So he must be expecting this third party, light, to fulfill his request or his desire or his will. But he's not directing this expression to light because it does. Anyways, I could spend a long time just thinking through verse 3 here. It's a very interesting verse. I think I posted earlier this semester a video of me walking through this, and every time I look at this verse, I think about something different in it. So it's just a very interesting, grammatically, syntactically, theologically, there's a lot interesting going on here. But the question we have is, how do we translate this? And the reason why most people translate it is because in English, when we're trying to translate a jussive, we usually do it by using either let or may. So may light be or let light be. These are ways of expressing our desire when we expect the response to come from someone that we're not addressing. And that's what this is. Let light be, or let there be light. Go ahead.
Before I looked at what the other part said, I wanted to make it high, like living, have something to do with that.
Yeah.
Is that the same? Like, is that similar in the form? You can't really make that a verb, right?
Well, the adjective chai is related to a verbal form chaya. Chaya means it was alive or it was living. It's a state of verb, but it begins with the chet instead of the hey. And many students actually confuse haya and chaya because honestly their meanings are relatively similar. One means he was or he is, and one means he was or he is alive. To be versus to live, those are very similar ideas. And obviously the spellings are incredibly similar, so you can see how they would get confused. But they are used very differently. They are used in different situations. And so it's important not to confuse them because you'll end up with a translation that actually is not very similar. So that's the idea here is haya is this idea of, and that's why I say it doesn't just mean let light be. It could mean let light become, let light happen, let light exist. It certainly wouldn't mean let light live or let light be alive. It's a very different sort of a meaning here. So again, I'm already thinking of new questions about this verse, but we'll leave it there and we'll say the translation here can be tricky because, English doesn't use the jussive. And so anytime you have a jussive, it can be a little bit tricky to translate. But as we move to the next one, you'll see that what happens here is we've got another vav relative. We've got another vayiktul form. Now, the strange thing about this is that we're used to seeing vav patak dagesh. And here we see vav patak, but no dagesh. I can't remember if I mentioned this in the last video conference or where I've talked about this, but I'm sure I have. And I think Fatato talks about it as well, but the description of the rule as he presents it is slightly different. I learned this as what's called the Skinnem-Levy rule. And Skinnem-Levy is just a memory aid. It's nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. You just say the utterance Skinnem-Levy to remind you of what sounds this applies to. So Skinnem-Levy, this rule applies to S sounds, sk, K sounds, skin, N sounds, Skinnem, M sounds, Skinnem L sounds, Skinnem Lave V sounds, Skinnem Lave E Y sounds. So it's basically, if I had to write this out, it would be the SKNM LVY rule. But it's just easier to say Skinnem Levy than the SKMN and whatever rule. So the Skinnem Levy rule says when you have a situation where you would have a dagesh and a schwa in the same letter, and that letter happens to make an S sound, a K sound, an N sound, an M sound, an L sound, a V sound, or a Y sound, then that dagesh may drop out. Because those particular sounds, when they're doubled with a schwa, they don't double well, or they don't like to double, or something like that. Whatever you need to do to explain that the dagesh may drop out. But that's why this is still a vav relative. It's still a vayiktol, even though it doesn't have the dagesh. That's just the Skinnem Levy rule at work here. Okay. So again, it's something that Fatano mentioned in passing, and I think he has a different memory aid for what the rule is, what letters apply, but it might just be those letters in a different order. All right. So all that to say, this is vav relative. This is vayiktol, and again, we see that it's really just the same form with the vav relative on it. So if this was the jussive, then this here sure seems to be the jussive as well. It's just vav relative. Well, of course, vav relative goes on the jussive or the perfect, and it's not the perfect, it's the jussive. So this is just the standard narrative form of hayah. So this says, and God said, let light be, or let there be light, and light was, light beed, light became, light existed. You know, any of those are possible translations here. So vayehi or, I'm sorry, you can see a little bit of the Hebrew doesn't rhyme in the sense that English rhymes, but you can find intentional similarities in sound. That's what rhyming is. It's a similarity in sound. It's a very specific type. You know, you've got rhyming, you've got assonance, you've got consonants. These are all different similarities in sound. Well, you can hear in Hebrew the similarity in sound. Vayomer Elohim Yehi Or Vayehi Or. So, I mean, it's very, I don't want to say poetic. It's literary. It's very literary, okay? So, that one's good. It's 12:01. I probably ought to go ahead and close down. But what I'll plan to do going forward is, you know, we've only got 2 more. Maybe I may do a video conference on finals week just as like a study session, I guess. So for the rest of the semester when we have video conferences, we'll just pick up where we left off here because I want to practice the parsing of these different forms. And we don't have to spend a ton of time on it. Maybe we just do 2 or 3 of them. In fact, that's about all we got through here today with all my technical difficulties. But before we close down, I just want to give you one more chance to make sure there's not anything else you have a question about, or anything else you'd like to cover quickly.
Nope, I think I'm good. Yeah.
All right, perfect. Well, if anything comes up, let me know.
Okay.
Hope you have a great weekend.
You too, thanks.
All right, take care.